In our last video, we covered the younger years of Franz Josef and how he came to power at just 18, crowned not in triumph, but over the ruins of his empire. But while he was being crowned, Hungary was in open revolt. Vienna had been bombarded by its own army. Metternich was gone, and now, at just 18, a boy emperor had been handed a broken world. This is the road to destruction. The World Wars. Today, we follow the teenage emperor as he faces civil war, revolution, and learns that blood, not policy, will hold his empire together. But this is not a story of triumph. It's a story of violence, vengeance, and the seeds of future disaster. The abdication of Franz Josef's uncle, Emperor Ferdinand I, left the empire fractured. Revolutions ignited across Europe, spreading like wildfire. In Hungary, nationalists demanded independence. In Italy, revolts erupted against Austrian domination. And in Vienna, the heart of the empire, the revolution was in full swing, the streets flooded with protesters and rebels. And at the heart of this resistance stood his mother, Archduchess Sophie, the empire's true power behind the throne. Franz Josef, just a teenager, was thrust into the role of emperor in the midst of chaos. His early decisions would shape the future of the empire. He was faced with two choices: use brutal force to reassert control or attempt reforms to appease the masses. But Franz Josef was not ready for either. He was too young, too inexperienced. His psychological state was fragile, and his decisions were often driven by fear and insecurity. And yet, in that chaos, the new emperor stood firm. From his first days, Franz Josef made it clear he would not bend to the revolution. No constitution, no compromise. He would rule by divine right, just as his ancestors had. The message was brutal, and it was clear: the monarchy would survive, or it would fall fighting. Behind the scenes, it was his mother Sophie and her allies who held things together. Ministers loyal to the old order closed ranks. Generals returned to their posts. And slowly, the empire began to prepare for counterattack. Franz Josef would not negotiate with revolutionaries. He would crush them. By the spring of 1848, Vienna was in chaos. Barricades filled the streets, gunfire echoed through the city, and revolutionaries fought to topple the government. The Austrian military, led by Prince Windisch-Grätz, laid siege to the city, hoping to crush the rebellion once and for all. But for Franz Josef, this wasn't just a siege. It was a battle for his soul, and for the soul of the empire. The young emperor watched as Vienna burned. His decision to use force was a pivotal moment in his reign. The siege of Vienna ended in bloodshed, but it also symbolized the emperor's determination to maintain his control. The reassertion of central authority came at a high price, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the legitimacy of the emperor himself. The use of military force against his own people deeply scarred the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects. Franz Josef had regained control, but the wounds were deep. Italy, too, was burning. In the spring of 1848, the Italian provinces of the Austrian Empire, Lombardy and Venetia, rose in open revolt. Milan, once the jewel of Austrian rule in the north, erupted in the famous 5 Days Uprising. Austrian garrisons were driven out by barricades and gunfire. The tricolour of Italian nationalism flew where the Habsburg eagle had once ruled. It was not just a local rebellion. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, under King Charles Alba, saw its moment. Italian unification was still a dream, but here was a chance to drive Austria out of the peninsula. Piedmont declared war on Austria, and the First Italian War of Independence had begun. Franz Josef was still reeling from Vienna, from Hungary, from the weight of an empire slipping through his fingers. In the Italian theatre, he could only watch as his army collapsed under the pressure. The elderly Field Marshal Radetzky, commander of the Austrian forces in Italy, had retreated into the quadrilateral fortresses, defeated but not broken. And then, slowly, the tide turned. In March 1849, just 3 months after Franz Josef's coronation, Radetzky struck back. At the Battle of Novara, he crushed the Piedmontese army, forcing Charles Albert to abdicate in disgrace. Lombardy and Venetia were reoccupied. Venice held out under siege, proclaiming itself a republic, but by the end of summer it too fell. Austria had won. But it was a victory soaked in bitterness. Italy had been subdued, but not silenced. The tricolour had fallen, but the memory of resistance would haunt Austria for decades. Franz Josef's image in Italy was one of foreign tyranny. The repressive crackdown that followed only deepened the divide. Italian liberals and nationalists would never forget the blood spilled in Milan and Venice. For them, Austria was not a sovereign, it was a boot on their neck. And for Franz Josef, the Italian war was a warning. Nationalism could not be reasoned with. It could only be crushed. As Vienna smouldered, another fire burned across the empire, Hungary. Hungary wasn't just rebelling, it was declaring independence. Led by Lajos Kossuth, a gifted orator and fierce nationalist, the Hungarian Diet had formed its own government, raised its own army, and begun reshaping the country into a liberal state. At first, they claimed loyalty to the crown. But as Franz Josef rejected constitutionalism, Hungary broke away. For the emperor, this was treason. And for Austria, it was an existential threat. But suppressing Hungary was easier said than done. Field Marshal Windisch Gretz was dispatched to crush the rebellion. At first he made gains, retaking Pest in early 1849. But his victories were shallow. Hungarian forces, under the command of General Artur Gergely, regrouped fast. And unlike Austria's conscripts, Hungary's soldiers were fighting for their homeland. The war became brutal. Executions, scorched earth, and the shelling of civilian towns became routine. Each Austrian victory bred more resistance. Each defeat chipped away at imperial prestige. By spring, the Hungarian army had launched a full counter-offensive. Austria was losing, and Franz Josef, just months into his reign, faced a choice: compromise or escalate. He chose the latter and turned to a force that terrified even the revolutionaries. The Bear. He sent a desperate plea to Russia, begging for military assistance. In May 1849, he formally requested help from Tsar Nicholas. The justification was simple: solidarity among monarchs, and the fear of revolution spreading like wildfire. Nicholas agreed, not just to help Austria, but to crush liberalism itself. What followed was one of the largest foreign interventions in 19th-century Europe. Over 140,000 Russian troops flooded into Hungary. It was a message to revolutionaries across the continent. The old order was striking back. For Franz Josef, this was salvation and humiliation. His throne would be saved, but not by his own might. To many, the young emperor had sold Austria's pride for survival. Even his generals grumbled. But Franz Josef was resolute. In his eyes, empire came before ego. By August, the combined Austrian and Russian forces overwhelmed the Hungarians. General Gergely surrendered. The rebellion was over. The Russian army, known for its brutal tactics, played a decisive role in crushing the Hungarian rebels. Their hopes of independence shattered, and Russia had inserted itself as a powerful influence over the Austrian Empire, further undermining Franz Josef's legitimacy. Worse still, the fires of revolution had only been smothered, not extinguished. With the rebellions crushed, Franz Josef now faced a different battlefield, one of vengeance, order, and fear. He turned to Baron Julius von Haynau, a general infamous for his brutality. Haynau earned a new name in Hungary, the Hangman of Arad. After 13 Hungarian generals were executed in a single day, thousands more revolutionaries were imprisoned, exiled, or conscripted into forced labor. Entire cities were put under martial law. The message was clear: Resist the empire and pay with your blood. But this wasn't just punishment. It was a desperate attempt to reassert imperial control. Franz Josef, barely 19, had seen his empire nearly dissolve before his eyes. Now he would rule with an iron fist. Across Europe, liberals recoiled. The Habsburg Empire had survived, but at the cost of its moral authority. Franz Josef wasn't a liberator. He was a symbol of reaction, and worse still, the seeds of future rebellion had just been sown in blood. What followed wasn't peace. It was a silence enforced by the gallows. An iron decade of martial law and merciless repression, a period where Franz Josef ruled with an iron fist, stifling any form of dissent and imposing harsh measures to keep the empire together. But the seeds of discontent had been sown, and while the empire may have survived the revolutions, it was clear that it would never be the same again. When Franz Josef took the throne in 1848, he didn't inherit a kingdom. He inherited a graveyard of loyalty. The empire was stitched together from dozens of nationalities: Germans, Magyars, Czechs, Croats, Poles, Italians, Slovaks, Serbs, Romanians, each with their own dreams of nationhood. After the revolutions, none of them saw Vienna as their home, and worse, many now saw Franz Josef as their jailer. In Hungary, he crowned himself without ever consulting the Hungarian Diet. No compromise, no consent. To them, he wasn't a king. He was an occupier wearing a stolen crown. Meanwhile, the Italian provinces seethed. Lombardy and Venetia had tasted rebellion, and they would rise again. Nationalism wasn't dying. It was simmering, waiting for its next moment. Franz Josef ruled an empire, but it was an empire in name only, fractured, furious, and boiling just beneath the surface. He had won the war, but he had lost his people. Austria had survived. The revolutions were crushed, the empire restored, but what remained was not the same empire Franz Josef had inherited. It was quieter now, but colder. An empire ruled by fear, bayonets, and the memory of chaos. And in saving his throne, Franz Josef had saved his empire, but only by making a deal with the devil. And soon the devil would demand payment in Crimea. Next time on Road to Destruction, we cover Austria in the Crimean War. How a grateful Tsar became a bitter enemy, and how Austria's loyalty to no one left it truly alone.